Hello, my wonderful viewers, and welcome to another episode of Betty Adams Interviews. Today, I am interviewing. Introduce
My name is
yourself.
Matthew. Matthew. I am currently a driving instructor or driving teacher on the island of Montreal, and I used to be a trucker for a good 7 to 10 years, about doing small little things here and there.
All right. So, you say you've been trucking for 7 to 10 years.
About that, like about 5 years, I was doing about stuff like delivering FedEx parcels, UPS parcels in a small truck, and another 5 years combined, I was working with big trucks, um, handling the bigger loads going from local areas in Montreal, Quebec City, and surrounding.
Okay, so can you tell us what's the difference? I mean, I know this is a big question, but what is the difference between a small truck like a van that you can drive with a standard license and a full-on semi with a tractor with two tractor trailers behind you?
Uh, this is going to sound weird, but power. That was what I felt. Because when driving those big trucks, you knew no one's going to mess with you. You know that as a big driver, no cars, no other vehicles will ever dare to mess with you unless they're complete idiots, because you're big. I've been in two accidents where I walked away scot free with barely a scratch on my vehicle, and the vehicle that hit me got completely pulled. These
Wow.
are monster machines.
I know when you're taking your
So,
driving safety lessons, I live in basically semi-country between the loggers, the ranchers, and the big industry from Portland and Seattle.
okay,
There's a lot of them coming off small roads, merging onto the interstate. They warn you those things can't stop. They have the right of way. And
agreed.
especially when you meet a logging truck up on a road, if you're not a logging truck, you back up however many miles you need to let that guy pass you.
Absolutely. Would you mind just giving me 1 second, please?
Go for it. Could you tell us something more about the technical difference? So, if you could imagine one small vehicle you were really familiar with, and then
Mm-hmm.
imagine the semi you were most familiar with. What's the actual difference? You're in there, you've got your hands on the steering wheel. What's the difference in body mechanics and shifting that you're looking at there?
Okay, so just to go over a few things about trucks, you have two types. You have the manual trucks, and then you have the automatic. Automatic trucks, there's not much anything different between an automatic truck versus an automatic car, unless you're talking about the massive size, which then you have to worry about the turns, etc. Now, when dealing with a manual truck, that's where things get different. Excuse me. I don't know how familiar you are with manual cars,
I learned on a
but
four on the column.
okay, so then you know about the upshifting and downshifting, right?
Right.
Well, when it comes to a bigger truck, uh, there's 13 gears that you have
Wow.
to upshift and downshift to.
I learned it on
And
three and
when
I'm practiced on five, but
there you go. And then what you have to do now is you also need to add a little bit more with the revving and controlling your RPMs to try and double clutch, as the terminology goes. And that's where you basically have to put the vehicle in neutral by clutching the first time, taking your foot off the clutch, and then pressing the clutch again to put it into the next gear. If you're not careful, you're going to end up grinding the gears and not being able to put your vehicle into the gear that you need. Then that's going to slow down, and then you're going to have to find a new gear to go into if you're not careful. So there's a lot of techniques involving it. The major advantage to that is, I know companies are not going to like this, but you could easily basically change the gear of a big truck without even pressing on the clutch once, because of the way a truck is built different from a car. So that is the major aspect. And because of that, doing handling turns ends up being a lot more difficult than in an automatic truck or vehicle altogether.
Interesting. Could you expand on that? Why is handling a turn specifically different?
Oh, so when you're turning, doesn't matter what vehicle, you need to be at about, I'd say, 10 to 20 kilometers to turn right, which I think would be about uh, I would think about maybe 2 to 5 miles per hour. I'm not too sure the how the rate works
That
for that.
sounds about right because 55 is 80. So that conversion
That's
sounds
it.
about right.
So when you're turning right, you need to go about 2 to 5 miles per hour, and you have to slow yourself down. Now, when you're dealing with a big truck, you got to slow yourself down. If it's a manual truck, you got to put yourself into the proper gear to make sure that the truck continues driving smoothly. And now you have to adjust yourself accordingly to the lane and to the turn. So what that means is if you see a trucker with the right turn signal on and they're a little bit in your lane, let them. They're trying to turn right. The
See
rules
that
stated
that's
that
one thing I can see from the outside. There's that big old every single truck I've seen has a big old sticker on the back of the trailer saying caution vehicle makes wide right turns. And then they half of them have a little diagram that basically shows stay the heck back.
absolutely. Um,
Yeah.
like I don't want to scare anyone when I say this, but if a trucker takes too much of a right turn, our back tires from the trailer are going to go on the sidewalk. And I actually had a student's uncle lose their legs because of a trucker that went too close. So it's something that we have to take in consideration. It's the trucking industry or just driving a truck is incredibly powerful because there is nothing that can stop you unless it's another truck or a solid wall. And at that point, depending on what your cargo is, chances of survival are very slim to none.
Wow. That's a very serious line of work there. So
Well, that it is.
tell me some more
Well,
about just sitting in the cab. What's it like? What's the foot room like? How do how did you generally keep your cabs arranged? Because I know in a car you've got everything's really tight and compact. You've got more or less leg room depending on the design. What are you doing with your feet in a semi when you're not shifting?
so that depends on the type of truck you're driving as well, because you have two different types. One that's called a day cab and one that's called a sleeper. So a day cabs are usually the trucks that you see that are very flat,
Yeah.
and there's
Basically
not much room
logging.
to
I think of
grow
them
in.
as logging trucks because all the logging trucks I see are day cabs and all the long hauler ones are sleepers. Although I'm sure there are sleeper logging trucks. They just don't in my corner of the Pacific Northwest. They're generally not.
That's it. So, and then the sleepers are the ones that actually is basically a small apartment. It's got a bed, microwave, mini fridge. It's got power to, handle technology like a computer, a sleep apnea machine, or anything of the sort. I mostly worked with day cabs, so for me, it was just trying to keep my truck as clean as possible, like I would my car. Um, I have driven a sleeper when I was practicing, and I had to say it was a completely different feeling. When you first get into a cabin where you're seeing a bed in the back, it's like, okay, you know what? Cross country trips become more and more noticeable. It's a feeling of like, yep, the open road is gonna be my home, and if you love it, you're gonna love it. It's something in that sense. Whereas, well, nowadays we got to be a bit careful. Things like I don't know how it was back in the day, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, but I'm noticing nowadays it's getting more and more difficult to be a trucker.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that. So I don't know if you're professionally old enough to have a strong opinion on this, but when I was very, very small, there was a debate between long noses and flat noses and their various safety. And then my understanding is that as it went from the 80s to the 90s on, the long nose with the engine right up there in front got safer and safer as they refined the design to reduce the blind spot. So correct
Mm-hmm.
me if I'm wrong, but I believe the long nose had certain benefits, but it had giant, massive blind spots where people and animals could be hidden and get hit, and it was harder to maneuver them. Whereas the flat noses had certain benefits, but they were one of the major ones was safety. And so there was that trade off there. But then they started engineering the long noses to have fewer blind spots or smaller blind spots. And do you know anything about that? Is that something you are aware of?
So uh, I am and I'm not. Like I don't really have much experience behind a flat nose, but I can argue that it really depends on where you're going. If you're making local deliveries in a city or an area where there might be tight turns, I would 100% agree. Flat nose is the best way to go. Because I used to do a lot of local deliveries on the island of Montreal, and there was times I wish I had a flat nose because I just there wasn't enough room between me and other vehicles in front of me. Whereas I could make the argument long nose would be better for long haul if you're just going from terminal to terminal because that's all you're doing. You don't have to worry as much for space, and there you can have a little bit more power in your engine, and you don't have to worry about um, the cabin or lifting up the driver's cabin to get to the engine because that's one of the issues with a flat nose. To get to the engine to check it because we truckers have a daily inspection that we need to do. You know, we got to lift up basically the entire cabin, the seats, the gears, the everything to get to the engine of a flat nose, depending on the make and the model. Whereas a long nose, you just have to pop the hood in its own unique way. Therefore, it's a little bit easier to check the engine, to check the pieces and to check the pieces and everything of the sort. So,
Okay.
I mean, for that one, like I said, I really don't have much experience with a flat nose. So, um, it could be other truckers might disagree with me, but to each their own when it comes to long versus flat. That's how I view it.
Okay, could you expand on that inspection thing a little bit? Because I check my oil, my power steering, and my coolant every time I get in my little Subaru, and kick the tires, make sure the pressure is right. What is that? How does that look different in a semi?
Well, it's depending on whether or not you roll, because when you're doing an inspection, you're checking everything about the truck. And I don't know what the rules are in the states when it comes to the what I call the VAD, la vérification avant le départ, or the pre-check inspection and the post-check inspection. But you need to verify not just the oil, you need to verify the power steering to make sure all the belts are working properly, that there's no cracks or tears in them. When you're checking the tires, you got to make sure there's no bump, there's no objects in it, that there's no leak. If there's an object, if there's a bump, guess what? You're not driving. Legally speaking, you're not supposed to be on the road. If a cop or a highway patrol officer were to if a highway patrol officer were to pull you over and they saw a major defect in as you're driving, well, you better make sure you have a good reason why you didn't report it in the pre-trip. If not, you're going to be looking at hefty fines for breaking the rules and regulation, and you're going to be stopped right there and then until that particular issue is fixed. And it's not just the tires, but we also have to check things that you normally would not see or not really pay attention in a car, like I think they're called U-boats, if memory serves me correctly. And you also have to check the plates that are attached to the U-boat. If there's a crack on them, guess what? You're not driving. It's considered dangerous. You got to check the pins to the. You got to check the pins to the whatchamacallit, to the trailer uh, for the air brakes, which that in itself is its own unique thing. I don't know in the States if it requires a license to drive with or without air brakes, but I know here in Canada you can't drive a truck without having knowledge on how air brakes work because they're so much different than hydraulics. So we got to make sure that's working. We got to make sure that there's no air leaks because of that. And then you have what we call the fifth wheel, which is the wheel that attaches the trailer to the truck. You got to make sure that everything's up and running. All the nuts and bolts that are attached to it, you got to make sure that they're present. If at least here in Canada, if 25% or more of that bolt is missing, guess what? You're not driving. There are certain minor defects, like if one of your flashers aren't working, you have about 48 hours to get it repaired. And after that 48 hours, you're legally not supposed to drive. And a lot of truckers don't do that. You know, it's the lights. Even the cops don't tend to bother us too much with that, but these are still regulations that we have to abide by. Yeah, and then you have the trailer, the wheels in the back to make sure that the air brakes, the suspension, because everything at this point isn't hydraulics or pins, but they're using air cushions to do said thing. You also got to make sure about your load to make sure that's proper. And as a trucker, it's your responsibility, no matter how ridiculous it might be, to make sure that your load is loaded properly. Now, how we do that, that is depending on the trucker, depending if there's a scale nearby, but it's not something that we could really do because we can't really check to see where everything's positioned. We have to trust the loaders on that one. But as a trucker, if we are noticing our trailer is like tilting a little bit to the right, we know the weight at that point is no longer properly distributed. At that point, it's our responsibility to let the dispatcher know that, hey, get your guy to redo it because I'm not driving this way. If the pressure, if it's not properly balanced, when you're making a turn, well, you're going to need to really, really start to slow down because that weight is going to add to the momentum and it's going to add to the center of gravity, which could end up toppling over your truck if you're not careful.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Matthew. This has been really, really great. And this is really going to help me with my writing project. So, do you have, generally, when I involve a creator, I say plug your plugs. Do you have a business you want to promote?
As of right now, I do not. If ever I do start with a business or if I do start my own personal venture, which honestly I might, would you mind if I share it down the line with you, Betty?
Absolutely. Get in contact with me. I'll come up and interview you again. Gladly. You're a very good interview or interviewee. Guest. Guest. That's the word. And just kind of wrap it up, what was it? I'm doing this for my Dying Embers universe. The actually secondary characters in the book are these two truckers that are heavily involved. And one of them is a regular human, and one of them is a feral tentacle monster that lives in the engine of his truck. That's why I had all the questions about older engines, because he doesn't like switching out his body too often, because he has to extend his nerves systems throughout the rest of the truck, and it's a painful process to rip him out and put him in a new one.
Yeah, that's awesome. I would
Okay.
agree with that. Yeah.
All right. So thank you for coming, and we'll call that a day.
Drake McCarty's leg was shattered, deep in the wilderness. As the flash flood closed over him, something alien pulled him from the waters a military base that shouldn't exist, an ancient warrior with secrets of his own. Drake returns to his family with a whole leg and the burden of a secret he doesn't understand. In the forest around them, someone is watching, and something followed him home. Flying Sparks. 90,000 words of science fantasy adventure. The first novel in the Dying Embers universe is now available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo by Rakuten, Google Play Books, and from the author as a signed copy. Get your copy now and step into a world where dragons walk the forest, aliens lurk on the mountain, and things go boomp in the night.
Escape into another world with the writings of author Betty Adams. Two worlds, one of utter absurdity, one of dramatic tension, both alike in aliens absolutely astounded by human behavior. Humans are weird, short, absurd science fiction stories. Flying sparks, dragons, aliens, and things that go boom in the night.
Books available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo by Rakuten, Google Play Books, and at authorbettyadams.com for a signed copy.